Imagine a literary mystery, one that's baffled brilliant minds for over 130 years. A puzzle hidden right there in plain sight, where, well, misplacing just a single letter could completely overturn centuries of understanding. We're talking about a lost medieval text, yeah. A famous poet's confusing references, and even a medieval preacher using, well, basically the pop culture of his day to keep his congregation totally hooked.
It really does sound like the setup for some kind of historical thriller, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But, this isn't fiction. This is the real nitty-gritty work of medieval scholarship. And it's just a fantastic testament to how profoundly a small, maybe overlooked detail can alter our entire historical and literary landscape.
Exactly. And that's why we're so excited to dive deep with you today into this fascinating story, the story of the Lost Song of Wade.
Hmm.
This medieval English literary work was, well, till very recently, radically misunderstood. But thanks to some amazing work by Cambridge researchers Dr. James Wade and Dr. Seb Falk, this enduring mystery has finally been cracked wide open.
Yeah. So our mission for this deep dive is really to unpack how this incredible discovery reshapes our understanding of medieval literature and how it finally makes, elegant sense of some really puzzling references in Chaucer's work, which is huge. And it also reveals some surprising, maybe even startling insights into medieval society and the art of preaching back then. You'll hear how an entire narrative can pivot on just a few letters, and maybe why this ancient tale still resonates with us today.
Okay, let's unpack this. So, for generations, scholars, we're talking big names like the famous M.R. James, they were just completely stumped by the Song of Wade.
Yeah.
Well, this tantalizing fragment was first discovered way back in 1896 by James, actually, along with another scholar, Israel Galuntz. They found it inside this collection of medieval texts, Peterhouse MS 255, which is kept at Peterhouse College, Cambridge. Now, they identified it as a lost 12th century romance, which was a big step, right? But its actual content, what it was about, that remained stubbornly obscure.
And that's really the heart of the puzzle. For nearly 130 years, the consensus among scholars was that this Song of Wade, it was this bizarre, monster-filled epic, crammed with giants and fantastical kind of otherworldly creatures. But this interpretation, it always left scholars scratching their heads a bit, especially when they tried to connect it properly to other known medieval works. It just didn't seem to fit the usual patterns of the time.
It's kind of hard to imagine, isn't it? So many brilliant minds poring over the same few lines for decade after decade. James Wade, one of the researchers who cracked it recently, he put it perfectly. He said, "Lots of very smart people have torn their hair out over the spelling, punctuation, literal translation, meaning, and context of a few lines of text. They were all trying to piece together this legend that just refused to fit neatly into any known box. It was like a scholarly Gordian knot, just seemed impossible to untangle."
Yeah, but the power of that struggle, I think, really highlights the commitment of these scholars. They sensed something significant was buried in those lines, even if the pieces didn't quite fit. It says a lot about the power of just persistent, almost obsessive questioning in historical research.
Okay, so with generations of brilliant scholars stumped, what finally cracked the code? The answer, maybe surprisingly, came down to a single tiny error hiding in plain sight. And this brings us to the aha moment. The recent breakthrough by Dr. James Wade and Dr. Seb Falk, both fellows at Girton College, Cambridge. The core of their findings, which they published in the Review of English Studies, it really hinges entirely on spotting a crucial scribal error.
Exactly. The breakthrough was, in a way, remarkably simple, but the impact was profound. It seems a medieval scribe, copying the sermon centuries ago, probably confused the letters Y and W, and this led to a fundamental misreading of just 3 key words in the text. And this tiny error, almost negligible you might think, it just cascaded through generations of scholarship, completely hiding the real nature of the story.
It's just astonishing to think about. That one slip of the pen basically changed the entire translation, changed the whole feel of the story. So the original mistaken translation read something like, "Some are elves and some are adders, some are sprites that dwell by waters. There is no man, but Hildebrand only."
Right. But the corrected translation, thanks to Wade and Falk, now reads, "Thus they can say with Wade. Some are wolves and some are adders. Some are sea snakes that dwell by the water. There is no man at all but Hildebrand."
Wolves, not elves. And as Seb Falk himself put it very clearly, changing elves to wolves makes a massive difference. This single correction, it doesn't just tweak a few words, it fundamentally shifts the entire genre of the legend, the whole category it belongs in. It instantly moves from this world of mythical monsters and giant, the fantastical, the otherworldly, to what the researchers call the human battles of chivalric rivals. Wow. That is a staggering transformation. So this isn't just about, like, literary classification. It redefines the characters themselves. So what about Hildebrand then? How does his usual image, as Wade's maybe giant father, how does that fit into this new chivalric world?
That's a really good question. Traditionally, Hildebrand is often shown as Wade's father, and yeah, in some folktales, he's definitely a giant figure. But with this new interpretation, especially seeing it as a chivalric romance, Hildebrand is now understood more as an ordinary man.
Hmm.
This brings him into a much more grounded, human-centered story, where the conflicts are less about, supernatural power and more about the earthly struggles of knights, their rivalries, their honor. It's a really remarkable reevaluation. Heroes become human and their struggles feel more relatable.
This shift feels huge. Can you help us understand a bit more what exactly a chivalric romance is and why putting Wade in that genre is such a big deal?
Sure. So, chivalric romances were incredibly popular stories back in the Middle Ages. Unlike the older, maybe grander epics about gods and monsters, these romances focused on knights, their quests, courtly love, adventure, and importantly, human conflict and ethical questions. Think about the stories of Lancelot or Gawain or King Arthur's court, those kinds of tales. They resonated because they explored human virtues and vices, loyalty, betrayal, the messy parts of human relationships. So, by rereading Wade's story as a chivalric romance, he's suddenly not this forgotten, weird, fantastical outlier. Instead, he kind of takes his rightful place as a major romance hero, alongside those famous figures whose stories were loved for centuries. It gives him a much more logical place in the literary history, a hero whose adventures would have gripped audiences back then.
And as James Wade points out, changing it to a chivalric romance suddenly makes so much more sense of why someone like Chaucer, Geoffrey Chaucer, would mention Wade in stories about courtly intrigue. It just clicks into place, doesn't it? It clarifies not just Wade's story, but also helps us appreciate Chaucer's own wit even more.
Absolutely. This new perspective lets us connect the dots in a way that just wasn't possible before. It's not just about correcting a word, it's about understanding the whole cultural background that would have surrounded a story like Wade's, and how that understanding then unlocks layers of meaning in other seemingly unrelated texts like Chaucer's.
Right. And the implications of this new understanding, they stretch way beyond just the Wade legend itself. For generations, Chaucer scholars, the people dedicated to figuring out all the complexities in Chaucer's work, they were genuinely baffled by his two references to Wade. These were from the late 1300s. These mentions just felt completely out of place when everyone thought Wade was all about monsters and giants.
Precisely. It was a real problem for Chaucerians. How could the master of wit and social observation refer to some monstrous, mythical figure in such, ordinary and character-revealing ways? But now, understanding Wade as a popular chivalric romance, these references become not just clear, but actually even more clever.
Okay, let's take Troilus and Crusade. There's a key moment where the character Pandarus tells the tale of Wade to Crusade after supper. Now, if Wade's story was a monster epic, that allusion makes very little sense in the scene. Why tell that story then? But if Wade was a popular chivalric romance, well, then it makes perfect sense. Pandarus would use a well-known romantic story, not just to keep Crusade's attention, but also, as the researchers suggest, to stir her passions. It's a classic Pandarus move, isn't it? Using stories manipulatively.
And this really raises an important point about how we read literary allusions, I think. When we understand the source material, like the original audience would have the common knowledge, the hit stories, the author's intention, and their wit just shines through so much more clearly. It's like finally getting an inside joke that's been flying over your head for, 600 years?
Huh?
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's The Merchant's Tale. Chaucer's character January. He's this rather unpleasant 60-year-old knight. He refers to Wade's boat when he's arguing that it's better to marry young women than old ones. The researchers argue that the fact his audience would have understood this reference in the context of a chivalric romance, a story of human adventures, maybe human foolishness rather than some vague folktale or epic. That's hugely significant. As James Wade puts it, quote, reveals a characteristically Chaucerian irony at the heart of his allusion to Wade's boat. It's just a perfect example of how new findings can light up and enrich these old texts, giving them an even sharper comedic edge.
Yeah, it's a powerful demonstration of how these seemingly small shifts in understanding can unlock whole layers of meaning. It lets us appreciate the subtle humor, the social commentary, the complex characters in these ancient works with fresh, informed eyes. Chaucer wasn't just name-dropping. He was tapping into entire narratives, trusting his audience to get the full, rich context.
It's pretty amazing that such a key literary fragment was actually preserved inside a sermon, of all places. So let's turn to the Humiliamini sermon itself. where this piece of Wade's song was found. It's a late 12th century text, part of that Peterhouse MS 255. And for the first time, researchers have strongly linked it to the famous writer Alexander Neckham. He lived 1157-1217, a really influential scholar and abbot in his day.
And what's really fascinating here is the specific historical context of that sermon. Seb Falk describes it as a kind of creative experiment. It was written at this critical moment in the 12th century when the church was really trying harder to engage ordinary people, the lay audiences. Preachers were realizing that the old-style theological arguments weren't always connecting with everyone, so there was a real push to make sermons not just easier to understand, but actually captivating, engaging. And this sermon seems to be a great example of that innovative approach.
So if preachers were trying to connect, this is where the medieval meme idea comes in.
Yeah, that's Falk's term. He says, here we have a late 12th century sermon deploying a meme from the hit romantic story of the day, which is incredible, really. It's very early evidence of a preacher weaving popular culture into a sermon just to keep the audience hooked.
And it brings up this surprising element of, well, adult content, as James Wade called it. He notes that many church leaders worried about the themes of chivalric romances, adultery, bloodshed, and other scandalous topics, so it's surprising to see a preacher dropping such adult content into a sermon. It wasn't just about making it relevant, it was about using stories that were already gripping people's imaginations, even if they were a bit racy.
Exactly. What this really shows us is that the line between sacred and secular, between, high culture and popular entertainment, was probably much more blurry in the Middle Ages than we sometimes think. Preachers weren't just delivering dry doctrine, they were performers. They were adapting. They were using the very stories that thrilled their congregations outside the church. The challenge of engaging an audience, even in a sermon, it's remarkably timeless, isn't it? It shows a very practical approach to communication.
But the sermon's message wasn't just about entertainment. It used these familiar ideas to deliver a really profound lesson in humility. Humility was a huge concern for medieval theologians, and it did this by comparing human behaviors to animal traits.
Right. It's a clever rhetorical strategy. The sermon talks about powerful men who become like wolves by plundering, by preying on the weak, taking what isn't theirs. And it compares cunning, deceitful people to adders or water snakes, highlighting their sort of sneaky, dangerous nature. James Wade really emphasizes how relevant this still feels today. He says, it warns that it's us, humans, who pose the biggest threat, not monsters. It's a timeless warning about human flaws.
And the preacher didn't stop there with the topical stuff. He also used the story of a real-life knight and crusader, Hugh of Gournay. Apparently, this guy was notorious for switching sides 4 times between England and France. And this specific story doesn't seem to appear in other surviving sources, which strongly suggests the audience would have known exactly who he was talking about, this contemporary, maybe slightly scandalous figure.
Yeah, that detail gives us such a vivid peek into the shared knowledge and maybe even gossip of the time. It shows the preacher really knew his audience's interests. And Hugh's act of repentance, apparently wrapping a noose around his neck and throwing himself on the mercy of the French king. Seb Falk calls that a powerful and really fresh symbol of chivalric humility. It's a dramatic picture of how even powerful people were expected to perform these public acts of being sorry. And just circling back to the authorship point, the researchers found lots of striking similarities in the arguments and writing style to Alexander Neckham's known works, which strongly suggests it was either Neckham himself or at least someone who really knew Neckham's sophisticated style and knew how popular Wade's story was at the time. Neckham was famous for his wide knowledge and weaving different sources together.
So after all this, what does this incredible deep dive into the lost song of Wade really mean for us today?
Well, if we zoom out a bit, this whole story profoundly reveals the incredible power of scholarly reexamination, of looking again. It shows how just one misinterpreted word can hide the true meaning for centuries, and how fresh eyes, combined with really careful linguistic and historical research, can unlock these huge world-altering insights. This discovery doesn't just tidy up a literary puzzle, it fundamentally challenges our assumptions about how stable historical texts are. And it highlights the crucial, maybe often overlooked, role of medieval scribes in shaping how we understand the past. It shows how even tiny errors could send scholars down the wrong path for ages.
Yeah, and it also enriches our understanding of medieval literature, doesn't it? And popular culture back then, and the really inventive ways medieval communicators, like that preacher, engage their audiences. It makes you realize that the human condition, with all its flaws, its search for meaning, its need for good stories, it really hasn't changed all that much over the centuries. We're still wrestling with similar questions and looking for compelling stories.
Absolutely. And for anyone who loves Chaucer, this discovery offers a renewed appreciation for his incredible wit and clever references. It finally makes perfect sense of lines that have puzzled readers for generations. It brings a new depth and sharpness to his genius, really confirming him as a master of playing with the pop culture of his own time.
So we've seen how just a few letters, carefully re-examined, put back into their proper historical and linguistic context, have completely transformed a forgotten medieval legend, how they've clarified puzzling poetic references and given us this vivid, almost scandalous glimpse into sermon techniques from the 12th century.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other long-held assumptions or maybe lost bits of history might still be out there, waiting to be rediscovered just by looking at the same old texts with a fresh perspective? Or maybe just by correcting a letter or two. The past, it seems, is far from settled.
What overlooked details in your own field, maybe in your own work, might be hiding a massive revelation. So keep seeking those surprising facts. Because sometimes the biggest monsters aren't those fantastical creatures, but the ingrained misunderstandings we carry with us through the ages.